So let's talk about the Space Marine foot soldiers with bolters and chainsword, with an overview of battle line and other troop style equivalents in 10th edition Warhammer 40k. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Space Marines once more, and in this video I thought it would be worth having a look over the Space Marine troop choices and weighing up which ones are perhaps some of the more interesting choices in game right now, and a few of the pros and cons of the rest. This one's a topic that I've covered a couple of times in the past on the channel for previous editions. Obviously in 10th edition though, the whole idea of troops choices has really changed around quite a bit. Broadly speaking, troops became battle line units, and when it is, not everything that was previously considered a troop's choice moved over to that role. For example, the Phobos didn't get the battle line keyword, much of the scouts were moved away from the troop slot in days gone by. For this video though, I wanted to focus on the core codex and look at units that are either battle line now, have been troops in the past few editions, so things like the scouts and the infiltrators. I've decided for 10th edition I'd feature the Infernus Squad in this one as well. Maybe they're sort of akin to Hellblasters a bit, but given that they're short-ranged anti-infantry weapons and basically are pretty much intercessors beyond that, they do feel very equivalent. Plus appearing in the start collecting boxes, plus the Leviathan box, they do sort of feel like the troop-style marines out of those to me. For this video at least I'm going to leave off talking about Reavers and Sternguard. They feel maybe a little bit more specialised with deep strike or more equivalent to veterans than battle line troops. I'm also mainly going to focus on the core codex, though I might just cycle back just to mention other battle line things at the end of the video. In any case, jumping into the core troops units, first up we've got the standard Intercessors, pretty much the iconic Primaris Space Marine with a bolter, 80 points per unit of 5 of them, and typically for the most part Space Marine troops units, and just as a theme throughout this, typically just about all of these Space Marines with bolter equivalents tend to be fielded in units of 5. In general, there's far more value about them taking up more space on the board or being able to threaten multiple units, as opposed to putting them all together, which you'd usually do if you'd want a big damage combo of some sort, and that's usually best saved for other units. For the Intercessors though, they're standard Space Marine bodies, 2 wounds with a 3+ save, and in the unit you get 5 bolt rifles, all hitting with 2 shots at strength 4 AP1 with the heavy and assault keywords, a power fist or thunderhammer on the sergeant, plus an Astartes grenade launcher for a little bit of special weapon goodness that you get in addition to the bolt rifle. I feel like at 80 points they do their job fairly well. If you put their shooting and their melee damage together, they do actually pose a pretty serious threat to any light infantry squads. Lots of strength 4 AP-1 attacks, and then followed up with some strength 4 AP0, and then a whole bunch of power fist attacks in close combat. For a battle line unit that's maybe a bit more focused on objective holding, that's not really too bad compared with their equivalents in my opinion. I'd say they're pretty usable casually. In competitive lists they might get occasional play, though tend to be at least fairly low key in the amount that people want of them. The main draw for them is that objective secured special rule here. Marquee objectives in the command phase to get the sticky objectives type rule. It often makes sense if you've got at least one unit of intercessors, maybe have them mark your home objective at the start of the game, perhaps leave the defense of that objective to other units after that, and move towards the midfield to get that objective control 2 on midfield points, and maybe mark things with sticky objectives there. It's quite nice the way that they can turn on just a little bit more damage if they want to stay stationary, or can advance and shoot to get lines of sight and range and not compromise moving towards objectives. That's quite a good advantage for them, I think. They could also be handy enough for bodyguards for certain characters when you just want literally a low investment unit. You maybe don't want to shell out for company heroes, or for a character squad that can't take company heroes. Could be tempting enough for a cheap squad to go with Azrael perhaps, or for a bodyguard to go alongside Chief Librarian Tigurius. Overall I've chosen to give them a 7 out of 10, maybe tending to see niche competitive play as opposed to being present in every list at the moment. Next up we have the melee variant in the Assault Intercessors, 75 points per 5 of them. A similar kind of stat line, but a little bit cheaper at 15 points per model with objective control 2 Space Marines, and these guys can spam out a bunch of damage against light infantry on objectives, heavy bolt pistols for a few AP1 shots up close, and then charging in with Astartes chainsaws, 4 attacks with strength 4 AP1 and damage 1, plus either a power fist or thunderhammer, and you get 2 reroll wound rolls of 1, going up to all wound rolls on objectives, and that's genuinely a massive rule for trying to take out enemy heavy hitters. They're not going to do all that much against elite infantry, though I think that the bit of AP and the wound reroll do keep them relevant. Again, they can be quite a nice choice for escorting characters as well. They can potentially get the wound rerolls or the full wound rerolls in melee. Maybe it could be nice for things like Uriel Ventris, for example, or most other characters where melee is the main event. I've chosen to rate them a 7 out of 10 for most chapters. fairly nice and usable as cheap squads to move towards the midfield, and scrap over objectives with enemies and their equivalents, though I'd say that moves all the way up to absolutely top tier for Blood Angels and their Sons of Sanguinius. They just get so much value out of that formation. Each individual Intercessor going all the way up to Strength 6 AP -1 with 5 attacks on the charge, which is very scary. Never mind the nasty Strength 10 Power Fist, and anything any attached captains or sanguinary priests could do for the unit. In general though, perhaps a unit that's not too bad to have maybe 1 or 2 copies of going towards the midfield for most chapters, but again maybe doesn't tend to be a mainline damage dealer or a must-have unit. Next up, we've got the Heavy Intercessors at 100 points per 5, perhaps a unit that I feel might be a little bit underrated, as it is one of the single toughest and chunkiest Space Marine units for the points. These guys en masse can be a pain to deal with for plenty of armies. For just 20 points to get the entire profile of a Gravis Marine, 3 wounds at toughness 6 with a 3+ save. They do go down at least fairly easy to heavy weapons, but that's going to be a lot of raw toughness and wounds to slog through for most armies out there and most small arms. For their attacks, their bolt rifles get a little bit longer range and a bit more strength at strength 5. They get a heavy bolter within the unit in place of the Intercessor's grenade launcher and special weapon, though they don't get any melee bonus, no power fist or anything like that on the sergeant, which maybe is a bit of a weakness given that otherwise they'd be quite a nice unit for moving towards the midfield and making the enemy actually have to deal with all that durability. Their special rule just further shores them up against damage 1 attacks. They get +1 to the saves against those. Basically just underlines them that they really don't die to small arms very easy, but bigger hitting things can kill them at an okay rate of fire. As I've talked about in previous videos, Heavy Intercessors do kind of have a bit of an issue when compared with the other Space Marine units. They do tend to do quite well casually, though don't tend to get played very much at all in competitive. Being so robust, they are fairly easy units to use, even if they don't have that big a damage output for their points cost. And despite the boosted strength and range, they don't actually compare particularly well with standard Intercessors for that, given that they cost so much less for their guns. Their main issue for competitive play is they just tend to be a unit that doesn't hold the home objective quite as well as certain other options. The sticky objectives of the Intercessor squad is really powerful and they cost less, or you could have Infiltrators sat on the home objective and denying deep strike, which again is kind of godly if you're going for some extra value objective holders. It also perhaps doesn't help that their best attachment is probably the Anvil Siege Force, given that they've got heavy weapons, long-range guns, and a defensive profile where they could credibly sit out in the open. They definitely can be a lot scarier there, but that's just not generally considered to be one of the competitive Space Marine armies. I feel like that doesn't help them get played in top lists. Between those reasons, I've chosen to rank them a 6 out of 10, but don't get me wrong, they absolutely can be strong casually. Certainly big chunky units of these could give the opponent some real problems trying to clear them, and Space Marines don't really have all that many units with standout good durability, and it definitely makes them interesting to my mind. Next up, we've got the standard tactical squad. The Firstborn Marines, as seems to be kind of normal for them, have it kind of rough at the moment, 160 points per 10 of them, and just considered vastly outclassed by the other options by most people. They have the standard Space Marine stat line, but get flatly worse melee with 1 less attack than their Primaris peers. Something that does feel like a bit of a relic, really, particularly given things like standard Chaos Space Marines get more attacks than these guys now. Otherwise, their special rule is combat squads, which allows you to split the unit in half. I feel like that would be more useful if there was actually some more merit to keeping them as a full unit. In general, though, I feel like the vast majority of the time you'd want to combat squad them, maybe keeping the bolters and perhaps the heavy weapon back on a home field objective, but otherwise have the dangerous stuff move up the board to attack the midfield and put those more fun profiles to work. Their main issues is that for the same price, Intercessors just outcompete them in all sorts of different ways. Extra attacks in close combat, both on the regular guys and the sergeant, better bolters with a whole bunch of different keywords, the sticky objectives rule, and not having to be locked into an extra 5 guys with regular slightly subpar bolters for every exciting unit that you take. The only real advantage that the tactical squad has is getting a heavy weapon, which isn't nothing, but given that it's only one between 10 models, it's just not that overwhelming. In general, if you want to make tactical squads work in 10th edition right now, you probably want to run them as the Firstborn Crusader squads for the Black Templars while they're still a thing. Weirdly, they're both cheaper than the tactical squad, and you can take 5 models, and you get all the exciting stuff just in one 5-man combat squad, so pretty much flatly better in every way, if faction locked. Moving out beyond the battle line, scout squads have been troops for really quite a long time for the Space Marines. They were kind of weirdly moved into the elite section in a previous codex. I did maybe get them not wanting them to be front and centre and the thing that everyone took versus your standard guys with bolters, but at the same time it did feel weird that they were given the role of elites given their sort of Space Marines in training. In any case, in 10th edition they might not be battle line, but they got some fun new models and some very effective rules. They get 2 wounds, where in the past they had 1, though they only get objective control 1, not being battle line things, and only a 4+ save with their carapace armor. The standard loadout for the squad seems to be a chainsword for the sergeant, as that hits a bit better in melee. Either a heavy bolter or a missile launcher, and I think there's merits to both of them really. A sniper for single strength 4, AP2 and damage 2 shot, and then maybe you want at least some of the rest of them to have shotguns, giving them the option to advance and shoot if they need to do things like actions. Overall, for 65 points, there's perhaps more threat in the unit than you might guess. You do get their wounds on the table for relatively cheap, and they're pretty excellent in terms of positioning. You can infiltrate them up the board to start on midfield objectives or screen. You get to scout 6 inches, so you get a bit of reactive movement to whether or not the enemy gets first turn. Can be nice to hide them if the enemy is going first, or potentially even go super aggressive and do nuisance charge things turn 1 if you want it. And they have their special rule called guerrilla tactics, meaning that they can fade away and return to strategic reserve at the end of the enemy turn, potentially pretty handy in the late turns for harassing the enemy home field or potentially doing secondary objectives. In general, between all this, scouts do remain really quite a tempting pickup for the vast majority of Space Marine army lists at 65 points. One of those units that just seems to add value to the army no matter what detachment that you take. I've chosen to rank them a 9 out of 10. I feel like you can usually do a lot worse than having a couple of scout squads to hold the midfield. Next up, for 85 points per 5, we have the Incursors. These ones are the dual build guys with the Infiltrators, Phobos armoured troops since they came out in mid 8th edition, though in 10th edition they're no longer battle line and only have objective control 1. They still feel fairly akin to your standard troops with bolters though, but with a Phobos feel. Otherwise, they've got a fairly standard Space Marine profile. They have a 2-shot bolter that gets the assault and the ignores cover keywords, so flatly better than the tactical marine bolters still, and then paired combat blades in close combat give them a flurry of attacks, these one with sustained hits. Otherwise, they get to scout 6 inches, so can potentially threaten to take up positions in the midfield. A haywire mine that's good for a few mortal wounds if the enemy comes close to them, potentially 2d3 mortal wounds to a vehicle charging them could be quite a big deal. Though perhaps their biggest and most important thing is the multi-spectrum array rule that they have. You get to nominate 1 unit hit by this unit, and then all other Adeptus Astartes units making attack in the shooting phase get to hit that enemy unit on a +1. Does make for some very accurate fire, and potentially could be good enough to affect quite a lot of a Space Marine gun line. For that reason, I think if I was taking these guys, I'd probably just take the 1 unit of them and aim it for an army where you've got lots of units that could have potentially good effect with that. Lots of people focusing down 1 target, hitting on a 2+, means that alongside Oath of Moment means that you could have 2 enemy units that are marked for some very effective hits with the Space Marine force. Despite that being really quite a nice and easy to use buffing rule, I'd still probably rate them around a 7 out of 10. They're certainly not auto-include for Space Marine armies, though for a gunline build they can do quite well with a whole bunch of focused fire. Moving on to their Phobos brothers, the Infiltrators still seem to be maintaining their crown as one of the best objective holding units around. They're pricier than most, and they don't really do too much in terms of damage or defense, 100 points per 5 of them. They're just for a unit where you're dedicating a few more points to winning the overall battle and victory point game. Lots of lists are absolutely happy to use them and think that they're worth it for their Deep Strike Denial special rule. For their actual damage and defense, they have standard Space Marine profiles, so they get a 6+ feel no pain. That at least means that they're a fair bit more durable against damage 2 attacks and the like. Their Marksman Bolt Carbine gets the heavy keyword, which I think isn't the most helpful. A lot of the time that's going to be far less valuable than moving the squad, given that they're basic bolters besides that. And they also get a comms array for a 5+ to gain 1 CP, if you happen to target their unit with a stratagem, which I guess could occasionally work for things like the smoke stratagem or grenades, I suppose. Not the worst thing to have, I guess, if you don't have any other way of farming command points. Really though, the primary reason that you take these guys in the army is the Omni Scrambler's ability. It means that they're particularly nice for holding down your home field objective against an army that's got lots of scary deep strikers. Enemy units can't deep strike within 12 inches of them, so you know they're 100% safe from being charged. So they don't really need all that much support in defending the home field, and it means that if the enemy sets up just outside of that, hopefully you'll get a turn of being able to destroy and deal with them before they get to strike. Otherwise though, they certainly can be played differently. If the opponent isn't threatening to deep strike in with lots of 3-inch deep strikers or other similar things like that, you could just use them as infiltrators in the midboard. They're not going to be quite as valuable for the points for that compared with scouts in my opinion. I feel like it's just quite nice the ability to be able to flex depending on matchup. Just being somewhat sturdy Space Marines with a 6+ feel no pain is handy enough in the midboard if the opponent doesn't use deep strikers in a big way. You're still going to get good value out of them, even if they won't be quite as godly as if you were playing against an army with heavy deep strike, maybe things like Genestealer Cults or Chaos Demons. Overall, between all that, they're still a competitive staple right now. I've chosen to rate them a 9 out of 10. You definitely do pay a premium and take a bit of a damage hit overall, but it seems that the general consensus is that they're worth it. Lastly, and maybe the slightly more tenuous pick for Space Marine troops, given that they aren't battle line now and haven't been in the past, are the Infernus Squad. As said though, they do have light anti-infantry weapons, and their presence in Leviathan and the Start Collecting box sets very much feel like the troops of those box sets. They don't really feel like also dissimilar from things like rubrics with Warp Flamers in the Thousand Suns, for example. In any case, the Infernus Squad are 80 points per 5 Marines with Pyroblasters, a standard Marine profile with Objective Control 1. Their Pyroblasters are Flamers that get Strength 5, D6 auto hits, Strength 5, AP 0, Damage 1, adding Norse cover. Per the points, if you want to just destroy lighter infantry, they will outshoot everything on this list within that range. Plus can also threaten to do that in Overwatch in the enemy turn as well. A unit of 5 of these torching an enemy unit moving up to an objective could be quite a big swing. Otherwise, they don't get any sort of special sergeant equipment, no power fist or power weapons here. I'd say that in general their Purge the Foe rule is kind of a weak one. They force a battle shock on one enemy infantry unit in your shooting phase when you attack them if there's anything left. Maybe not awful to occasionally prevent stratagems, but that's going to be a bit hit or miss, particularly as in most circumstances the enemy is going to be likely to pass that test anyway, even if your target has the infantry keyword, which it won't always have. Overall, I feel like they're genuinely not bad. They do have more damage against their preferred targets at close range. They might sometimes struggle to get into that range as they don't have the assault keyword. I would say that compared with Intercessors or Assault Intercessors they're likely competing with, they maybe sort of feel like similar sort of utility in terms of damage dealer type units, but don't get that objective control to wait on objectives that they do, and I feel like they probably have just slightly less selling point overall compared with them, the biggest one being the threatened Overwatch. Overall, for most armies, I'd still say they're probably a little bit behind things like the Intercessor variants, even if I personally say not by much. Very usable casually now they went down in points to 80 points. I'd say if you wanted to play them competitive though, they're just going to be massively ridiculously better in Salamander's Firestorm Assault Force as opposed to elsewhere. You're just going to get so much more value out of them there. Those Flamers will be Strength 6. They get to get the Assault keyword so they can advance and shoot, and hopefully get more things in range. Plus they've got access to a +1 to wound stratagem, a devastating wound torrent stratagem, and maybe Vulcan Hestan of the Salamanders if he's around, allowing them to reroll all wound rolls, and even some transport tricks if you did choose to float them up the board in a repulsor. In general, I'd say that they're a pretty niche pick for the majority of Space Marine armies. They aren't unusable, but in Firestorm they're just generally very good, certainly a unit that you could have around and in multiples if you wanted. Finally, for the Divergent chapters, I thought I'd just whiz through the chapter-specific battle line units. For the Space Wolves, the Grey Hunters are 85 points per 5. They pay 5 points more than the Tactical Marines, but basically do their job better, getting 2 special weapons and a plasma pistol per 5 men. Plus the Astartes chainswords in melee and a power fist on the Sergeant. Overall, I feel like that's enough to justify a little bit more cost compared with the Intercessor variants, plus they get to shoot when they fall back or advanced as well, which is handy enough. I say they're not awful for a unit heading towards the midfield as a sort of bully unit, though you might be tempted by either the marking the objectives of the Intercessors or the cheapness and the big damage rerolls of the Assault Intercessors. I must admit I do quite like the Blood Claws for 140 points per 10 models. You do have to field them in a bit more of a ranked up squad, but that does get you a lot of pretty cheap power armoured Space Marine bodies, and they genuinely are pretty savage on the charge. 4 attacks each at Strength 5, AP 1 and Damage 1 when they charge into close combat with Berserk Charge, plus the option for special weapons and things, and they feel like they're a particularly nice unit to lead with Ulrich the Slayer, getting some serious rerolls against the right targets. Otherwise, for the Black Templars that seem to be the strongest chapter right now, their battle line units are fairly godly. Their Primaris Crusader squad is also 140 points for 10 models, and they get you a serious amount of attacks. For some reason their datasheet comes with just 1 extra attack baked into those chainswords at base. So all very blendy with 5 attacks on those Astartes chainswords per regular guy, never mind getting 2 power fists within each unit of 10, plus a power weapon on the Sword Brother. Generally that's just some pretty standout melee stats in the first place. They can scout 6 inches, so can get heading towards the midboard, and quite an efficient unit for certain things like characters and enhancements, say Grimaldus giving them a 5+ feel no pain, or the same thing from the Tannhauser's Bones. I certainly not dismiss the Firstborn Crusader squad either. If you want to run tactical marines but actually good, then they're one of the best ways to do so. A heavy weapon, special weapon, and power fist sergeant, all for 5 models at 75 points. They're pretty excellent in Ironstorm Spearhead in particular, where those single rerolls can do great work, maybe helping out a las cannon or multi-melter. Otherwise, for the Death Watch, they have their veterans, generally an army that's struggling quite a bit at the moment, but at least the veterans get some pretty cool war gear. With the likes of heavy thunderhammers and frag cannons in the unit, they can be upgraded to be really quite punchy or really quite shooty with certain character combinations. I feel like I do see quite a lot of Death Watch lists just going all in on the big Proteus kill team though, basically the Death Watch veterans plus the extra Terminators and other specialists, though I guess they're technically not a battle line unit. Finally, you can get battle line Outriders in the Stormlance Task Force and the Ravenwing Company of Hunters. At least Outriders are now priced at the cost where you might consider them against some other fast-moving skirmish options. They're still not very dangerous to the majority of units with only strength 4 and damage 1 attacks, but at 80 points maybe that just about gets them to the point where they're alright for skirmishing with enemy light infantry equivalents. You do get some fairly chunky biker stat profiles for that kind of points cost. 4 wounds at toughness 5 per model is at least fairly sturdy for fast movers. Generally, I'd say they're still going to struggle to carry the damage of the army though, particularly in the Stormlands, and the Ravenwing might be a bit more tempted to build around their Black Knights as opposed to these guys with the threat of the Plasma Talons, but could be okay with a few units working in concert to them, maybe going after lower priority targets that they can handle, or doing screening, move blocking, nuisance and secondary type things. With the Divergent-Chapter battle line units talked about though, I think we'll leave that there. Overall, for Space Marine troops things, I'd rate the 3 versions of Intercessors basically usable, but typically in small numbers. Maybe the one exception there being the Assault Intercessors for the Blood Angels, which are genuinely terrifying in Sons of Sanguinius with character support. If you widen the definition of troops that came from previous editions for things like the Phobos Marines and the Scouts, then I'd say that perhaps the biggest winners are the Infiltrators and the Scout Squads, still seeming to be some of the most auto-include Space Marine competitive units that are just happy doing what they do and helping you out with the objective game in just about any detachment that you should choose to field. Otherwise, beyond that, I'd rate both of the Black Templar ones as pretty standout and the Space Wolf ones as good alternatives to your Intercessor variants. A fair bit of value for the points, I'd say. Look forward to hearing your thoughts down in the comments below. Which are your favourite Space Marine troops or battle line units, and what do you tend to use in your actual army lists? If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. I'm sure we'll have more for the Adeptus Astartes in the future. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support and keep these videos coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few other advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.